What's been going on the last year is an explosion of unscientific thinking and perverse narratives.
Here in the West
until March 2020. Yes, absolutely.
Oh yeah, so it's a year since Crazy began.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to shake your hand because are we breaking the law now? This is what I wanted to ask you. Do you know
Hopefully.
if this is breaking the law? The 2 meters not happening?
No, but I mean that's obviously clearly a personal decision.
Yeah,
it has to be. No matter what they say, that's a personal risk decision.
But isn't that the essence of probably what we're going to talk about? Personal risk. So we can jump out of an airplane. I can eat as much shit food as I possibly want. I can drink myself to death. I can
smoke.
Knowingly take sexual risks if I want to. I can smoke. I can buy cigarettes in a local shop. I can do mostly anything I want. Well, up until last March. I'm still able to do all those other things, but we're in lockdown world where something like this is apparently against the law. For the greater good. We're protecting people by not sitting beside each other like this. Isn't that just...
Well, that's the narrative, yeah, and to an extent the law, though I know there's a grey area between laws and guidelines, etc. But
is it law? Like, so in other words, if you have people in your house like this now, is it against the law, an actual law, or is it guidelines?
I think the house one and having big crowds in the house, they are entitled to come in now and fine you. So I guess it's quasi-law or effectively under the emergency legislation. It's essentially law. I think the travel one is a little grey. And then the travel one, you've got a reasonable excuse and there's a long list. So obviously the Gardaí in Ireland, the Irish police, I think they're very well aware at the disproportionate response here, but they have to follow, their rules from the government. But I think many of them know that this is kind of crazy what's going on. So I think if you give a reasonable excuse, they'll be very happy to take said reasonable excuse. But the population now have become, and I've used the word psychosed, it's a strong word, but I think psychosis is a very good word for what's happened. We've had a year of relentless propaganda we've never seen before in the Free West, and it's been round the clock propaganda. And there are studies on humans that even a month or two of relentless propaganda, especially when it's wall to wall, takes away completely the ability of a human brain to independently think. So we've got an enormous groupthink to the point of psychosis, and the disproportionate nature is the problem. If we had the bubonic plague, then much of this may actually be warranted. Some people would still argue it's not warranted, freedom, but we have 99.97% of people in the world in a whole year where this has spread everywhere. 99.97% have not been affected in terms of mortality.
So this is excess. Is that what you're referring to?
We're talking around 300 deaths per million is the average for the world after a whole year of a high R virus that, let's be honest, is endemic and has been all over the place. Like in Ireland at Christmas, for God's sake, we hit 29% positivity in the PCR testing in a huge spike. That's a winter resurgence. But 2021 in Ireland will not have a notable excess mortality. But think of it, 30% almost were positive in the testing. The extent to which this had been around Ireland, in December or January, and it's come down perfectly down the Gompertz curve, just like all the influenzas in the winter before it, just like last April, the curve is independent largely of lockdown or masks. So there's 36 published studies now that all largely indicate, from analysing the actual data, not from modelling, that lockdowns and masks have largely left no track or trace of effectiveness.
Okay, well, so let's use as a grounding. We're a year into this, and lockdown has been used as the measure to control it. Do lockdowns work?
Well, everything works to some extent, but we're back to proportionality and quantifying things. So if a lockdown saved one life in a year, obviously you would never do it. It would be absurd. If it saved 100,000 lives in Ireland, you may very well lock down because, the payback is big. But the lockdowns, on average, have not really got a measurable impact anywhere in the world on affecting the curve and the outcome. Okay. And Sweden, with no lockdown and no masks, and we have video footage and photos sent to me all the time, they're barely even doing the 1 metre in Stockholm in shopping malls. So they have shopping malls with no masks and people shopping. So they did no lockdown and no masks, but they did do some stuff and a bit of distancing and work from home, but they're the perfect control. They are in the lowest third of excess death of all of Europe. This is published during this whole period of 2020.
Published, this you can get this, when you say published, where can you get it?
I can give the link. It's a Swedish professor did an analysis on the crucial metric. You cannot use COVID deaths because they are deaths of people who had a positive PCR. You must look at the excess death over the normal or expected. That is the only measure of a pandemic you can trust. And Sweden is in the lowest third of Europe with no lockdown and no masks, and the UK is nearly the highest, with lockdowns and masks at an incredible level. But they're only some examples of compares. So in science we use Popperian logic from Professor Karl Popper. So if you have a hypothesis that lockdowns are going to really give a great result and lower the curve, that hypothesis can be tested. If you find evidence to say that it's true, in other words, this country and that country did lockdowns and they had a better result, you can have any amount of that evidence. It never really proves the hypothesis. It's called affirmatory evidence. So it's basically evidence that suggests they work. But the killer thing is, if you have one negative piece of evidence against a hypothesis, that has amazing power. It's called the asymmetry of proof.
Okay.
Now, we don't just have one example that says the lockdown hypothesis of giving great benefit is wrong. We have myriad examples. So we have North and South Dakota, around 1 million people each, same region. They both had a huge surge. North Dakota put in lockdowns, business closures and masks. They panicked. They did a California. South Dakota, famously, the governor said no. She believes the science from top professors who say it's not really going to move the needle and it's going to damage your economy and your public health in the long run. So she said no. And I have photos from bars in Dakota during the surge, no masks, people in bars, normal behaviour. South and North Dakota have practically superimposed death curves, hospitalisation and cases. In other words, a perfect natural experiment, as good as you can get, and there is no difference in the outcomes whatsoever. We have Florida on September 25th, the governor, obviously a scientific man, brought in multiple professors from Harvard, Oxford and Stanford. So Bhattacharya, Professor Koldorf, Professor Gupta, top epidemiology and medical professors, experts in this field. And in September he had a meeting with them all by Zoom, and 2.5 hours they went through the science of what I'm saying. And he decided, we're not going to ruin our economy and our public health. We're going to manage and we'll extend hospital capacity if we need to, and we'll watch the situation. What happened? Florida for the next 8 weeks had no signal of increased anything. They had the virus in the population. They had people passing, sadly, aged mostly. So their lack of lockdown and mask would have immediately, within days, had an increase in positivity if it was effective. Nothing happened for 8 weeks. Then they seasonally began to rise with the rest of America. And they soundly beat California, who is the lockdown and mask capital of America. They got, in October, November, increasingly massive lockdowns in California, stay-at-home orders. California outstripped Florida's death rate and hospitalization by a mile. So there are 36 papers now that essentially did the analysis. I'm giving you anecdotal
Yeah,
points.
give me the papers, yeah.
Yeah. I'll give you the link. There's 36 in my list. I started off with around 20 several months ago, and they keep coming in. One came in 2 days ago. The lockdown measures and draconian lockdowns had no effect measurable on the outcome.
I'm trying to get a sense of, is there any studies that show the whole picture in the society, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. So cost benefit is fundamental to any public health intervention.
Yeah.
So we talked about the benefit.
Net gain. Net
Gain, yeah, or many terms. So the benefit we're saying is, if it's there significantly, it's not showing up in the actual data or the analyses. So there are a couple of studies that suggest that the lockdown did have a good effect, but they're from the people who brought in lockdown, like Imperial College. They modelled around 100,000 would die in Sweden. Actually, around 6,000 or 7,000 died. And in real mortality, a couple of thousand in 2020, when you correct for other things. So you can disregard those papers because they're methodologically flawed. So you go back to the 36 that say, guys, there's no real signal. Now, the cost of lockdowns, I have on the same web link a bunch of papers, and collateralglobal.org compiled all the papers showing the costs. So on child psychological health, on cancer diagnoses missed, on general population, depression, on heart disease outcomes over many years, and on the economy. So this is trillions of dollars destroyed, ransacked. So I think if you look at excess mortality, the proper measure, and you try and look at the cost benefit, you want it to be better than 1-to-1, i.e. the cost is less than the benefit. I'd say the cost is at least 10, if not 100 times higher than any putative or claimed benefits. Because we know the benefits are so minimal in mortality that you can't even measure them. Right, we know that. So the benefits are very limited. The costs are manifest.
Yeah.
I mean, they're enormous. They're incalculable, the costs. They're huge.
Yeah, so if you take our country, and what you're saying really is that the evidence, the overwhelming evidence, is that lockdowns don't work.
Or work very little.
Work very little, and then the impact is horrendous. So if they even work a tiny bit, that's what the evidence, they may work a tiny bit. But so for the people who say, we never know, sure, we have examples then of when we have, like, so you have Sweden, North Dakota, so that example, and you have Florida. But for people in Ireland, they kind of look, well, you know, this is the impression I get, that everybody would go, wow, we just don't know though.
Yeah, well, that's why we have science. So, you know, a lot of the authorities are saying, oh, we're sticking with the science. But anyone can say that, but it's not true. But the real science is what I refer to there. Actual analyses that are fair and unbiased. And in those analyses, you actually find that the study authors in many cases are almost excusing themselves, saying, look, we're not saying they're useless. Look, we're not, you know, they're almost putting in caveats because they know what they're saying is very embarrassing. But nonetheless, they're true scientists.
And so who are these studies? Like where, what colleges?
We have one in Lancet, we have University of Bristol, University of Edinburgh, a whole plethora. We have one just out from NMAS, very respectable. And then there's a whole bunch of preprints that are not fully peer reviewed and fully released into the system. But the analyses are still valid.
And what agenda? They have no agenda.
The Imperial College did one paper that struggled to get through peer review, and it's actually, I would say it's disgraceful that it got published. So the guys who said 100,000 approximately would die in Sweden by June 2020, and actually a couple of thousand in reality was what happened. Those guys then did a paper analysing what happened and claiming that the lockdown did indeed save lots of lives. But to give an example to the audience who are not overly scientific, they actually had Sweden in the analysis. And I thought, as I read this paper, I read papers pretty fast, I thought, how are they going to explain Sweden? Because they can't. You know what they did? This sounds funny, but it's true. They basically said that all the countries they picked achieved a great reducing in the curve from doing hard lockdowns. But Sweden, which didn't, how did they explain it? They said Sweden achieved the same result, a supposedly lower curve, by limiting crowds to less than 50. It's in the paper. So even to a layperson, you could say, hold on a minute. You're saying that that country achieved the flattening, the claimed flattening, by just having less than 50 in crowds, and in the other countries they had to lock everyone in their homes. That's illogical. It's illogical, but it got published. It got published. So I would say that's essentially, in my mind, that's fraud. It's fraud to publish a paper and even suggest something so nonsensical. And also, a professor, Stefan Homburg, in Germany, within 2 weeks of that paper, debunked it utterly in a preprint study. And I spoke to him about this, and he shows it clearly, which I knew anyway. The growth of death curve is very important to look at. So when you put in a lockdown, approximately 3 weeks later, because of incumbency and all this, you will see an effect on the curve from that lockdown. So you can see the death curve for the UK. When the lockdown became effective to affect the death curve, it was already down at 1 and flat. So when the lockdown actually had its effect, nothing happened to the curve. It had already collapsed. So in England and many, many countries, the speed at which this epidemic was rising was already slowing down from the first days and curling over. When the lockdown came in, the curve was already following the classic influenza European curve. And at most, it nudged it a little. But then you've got the killer. There's 2 good papers which model that if you manage with a lockdown to suppress the deaths somewhat, let's say you can by 15%. The costs are still way too high. But let's say you do. The modelling shows that you will actually cause more death of elderly in the long run, because by suppressing community immunity amongst the healthy, you're going to expose the elderly to more risk next season, next winter. So imagine the irony that the lockdowns, we know they achieve very little, but what little they achieve may translate into a higher death toll of the susceptible in the long run. So it's a catastrophic intervention, and that's why it was ruled out in all countries' plans. WHO, October 2019, ruled out any isolation of the exposed, only symptomatic.
I think that's important to repeat that, because it wasn't like on a whim that they decided that lockdowns wouldn't be a good idea at the WHO. There's 10 years of research on a plan of attack for something like this. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. Actually, much, much more, 30 years plus, but the culmination of all of Western science, October 2019 WHO guidelines, no isolation of the exposed. In other words, no isolation of individuals who may have been exposed to it. Never mind lockdown. They didn't even mention locking down because it was too absurd. And the UK pandemic response, decades in the making, it allows for up to 750,000 deaths in a really bad flu pandemic. Now think of that number. In a pandemic with 750,000 deaths in the balance, still no lockdown. Makes no scientific sense. And Ireland similar. They actually had around 70,000. And we know lockdown's only going to move the needle a little. So it was 10 times smaller than what they planned for. But they threw their plans out. The only reason this happened, and this is on the historical record, I can send you the clip. Bruce Aylward of the WHO went to China. He showed their normal epidemic curve, which is a classic flu curve, up and down. He pointed at it and said that curve came down because of China's lockdown. And the whole world needs to do this. That was where lockdown came from. A single point in time, the media were covering it, the journalists there, and he pointed at a graph and a single observation. I'm saying that curve turned because of China's lockdown. Complete nonsense.
So that's like just an opinion.
Just an opinion, but the opinion was shared with Tedros and the rest of them. And the rest is history. They managed to lobby. And then when Italy had a problem in northern Italy, and they have a major issue with their elderly health, it's catastrophic, and pollution and lots of other problems. And they have a major problem with their hospital system capacity. So Italy did get hit hard. It did. It's a tough virus. But they panicked. And the world put that wall to wall on the media, and that's what tilted England. And you had Imperial College, Neil Ferguson. He got the death count 10 times too high in his ridiculous modelling. So if you look at the 10 times death count of 500,000 people in England, and Italy seeming to be in a complete mess, and put it together, you have panic. Yeah. So this whole thing is defined by irrational fear. So yes, people have passed away, average age 80, median 83 or 4, but all lives are important. Yes, it's a tough virus, no question about it. It's probably like a very severe flu kind of thing, maybe like 1957 in impact. Yes, the hospitals have been underfunded for decades and they weren't able to handle this so well. That's a political problem, but that was a problem. And you can go on with the facts, but none of it justified flushing 50 years of Western science and pandemic management science down the toilet to simply, as Bruce Aylward did, copy China based on a single observation.
So what governments have evidence or proof that lockdowns work? Like actual unbiased scientific evidence?
There is no scientific proof, and that's a fact. And the
so
reason
I want to ask you that again. I'm just going to imagine I'm pretending you're a government minister now. No, you must have some evidence that this approach works. You wouldn't keep doing it otherwise. What is your evidence? Apart from everybody else doing it. Sorry, I'm getting it out on you now, you fuck. Where is you must have some evidence.
There is always some evidence for everything. I can show you some evidence that the moon is made of green cheese. Okay. So there's no such thing as zero evidence or 100% perfect proof. It's a continuum. But that's where Popper is so important. If you're going to use evidence to say a hypothesis is correct, it had better be bloody good because you're giving affirmative evidence, associational evidence. So if you show that the countries, all who did lockdowns, had much better outcomes, it's never a proof, but it's suggestive. The problem is they don't even have that bottom basement weak evidence of showing that lockdowns generally associate with better outcomes. They don't even have that, because I just told you it's the opposite.
Yeah. So the overwhelming evidence, if this was a court case, have you any backup at all for your approach?
No, you could never go to a court without being laughed out of it to say I can prove that lockdowns worked. Which you can prove they don't.
So then in that instance though, if you were a government minister, has all this evidence, those 36 papers that you were talking about, has that been presented in front of them?
No, these have been published, but no media will talk about them. So that's a different phenomenon.
But have they been sent to these government ministers? They have.
They just ignore them.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day...
is that criminal? Is that a criminal thing to do, to ignore the scientific evidence?
Well, if you send a politician...
I'm not trying to get you sent to prison or anything, but
no, well,
I kind of want to.
You've got to think of it and say, you're sending technical scientific studies and data to a politician. So think about that for a moment.
Yeah.
You might as well send it, I don't know, to a cat. And sorry, politicians, but people who go into politics, there's a natural selection in everything. So people who go into engineering are generally highly technical in nature. Now, some of them aren't, I know, I managed them for years, but in general. And if you go into politics, if you go into literature, you're probably not a hardcore tech nut, making your own cars. You might be more the other side of the brain, you know, literature, and you go into studying literature. If you go into politics, you're not a technical
Yeah,
guy.
okay, so they rely on the health, so NEFIT or NHS or whatever the equivalent in the UK and the US or whatever. So and Fauci being the king of them all, it seems.
Well, what Fauci comes out with is so stunningly misleading and incorrect. It's just almost like a comedy show.
But even like say NEFIT, for example.
NEFIT, okay.
Right. Have they seen these 36 papers?
They've no interest in them. Because NEFIT have already...
Is that not negligence?
Well, in my mind it would be, of course, but again...
To be looking at all the evidence and deciding the best strategy.
Since March 2020 and rapidly coming into April, the die was cast. The narrative was that the lockdown saved us. It was completely incorrect, absurd, but it was set publicly by all of these people. They all went with the guidance from WHO. They all did it, and there is no way on God's earth that afterwards they're going to say, look, you know what, all of that disastrous economic impact and massive waiting list that we did, we actually think it might have been wrong. No one will.
Yeah, and that's I think we'll get to the fact that they've had to double down now. That's what it seems like. They have no choice. But so let's take something as basic as masks. The Danish study came out. Has there been any other studies? And do masks work to prevent the spread of COVID-19?
Again, you'd have to say everything does something. But the Danish DanMask study was great. Now, it can't really test whether other people are protected by you, because it's just very hard to do that. What it looked at, though, is does it protect the person? So it's a proxy for the overall functionality of masks.
Yeah.
And it came up with, like lockdowns, no correlation. There was no result. They couldn't find any effect. So they kind of said, if the effect's there, it's very small.
Yeah.
But the truth is, because the p-value was way out, it found that there was no effect. That's a fact. Some people would whine, but it didn't check if it could protect other people. But that's very misleading, because the mask works both ways. If it's shown not to work for one direction, you have to assume it won't work for the other, unless you have other proof. Now, is there proof they work? No. Is there a massive amount of negative proof? Because all over the world, including North South Dakota, we have many other state comparisons where mandatory masks came in at different dates. Overwhelmingly, in every case, including Germany, all over the world, when mask mandates came in, the curve of the viral activity and impact did not shimmer or change in the slightest. So it's not just the size of a curve, because the death curve goes up and comes down. It's the shape. If you do an intervention in science, empirically you validate. Empirical means with your own eyes you look at the data. The curves when the mask mandates came in, no matter where they came in, they never in the slightest affected the vector of the disease. So imagine I told you that eating eggs would help with this. And all over the world, at different points in time, people suddenly started eating eggs. If you look and see that nothing changed anywhere in your problem, no matter when you did it, no matter where you did it, nothing changed. You have to say, you can take your eggs or not take your eggs. But to be honest, with no signal, that means eggs at best are close to meaningless.
And so for those who go, well, sure, look, it can't do any harm.
Well, it can, because you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry paid by our taxes, essentially, being created and causing enormous waste. We're talking about children's psychological development. And I thought in Ireland, actually, I'm speaking to Ireland now and the whole world, I thought when they came for the children, if they did, that would be the last straw. Because the Irish care about their children. But I'm stunned. The psychological development of Homo sapiens, we are a species that interacts with massive facial interaction. It's fundamental. That alone, you'd want to, if you're going to mask children, you'd want bloody good evidence. But we've just said, like lockdown, the evidence doesn't exist. So why would you do something damaging to personal freedoms, to bodily autonomy, to your whole society being changed into some kind of bovine. I mean, when I look at them going around with their masks on outdoors, which has zero science, and their eyeballs looking out, how can you do that with no credible evidence?
Well,
it's a lack of evidence. It's an extraordinary intervention.
And then my problem is that I would wear it. If somebody said to me, yeah, they definitely work, I'd wear them. But I
would too.
And what I find the most perplexing, and when it comes to kids, is if you want to wear a mask all day. Wear it in the house, wear it wherever you want to wear it. But you don't need somebody else to wear the mask for you then. Unless you need somebody to make you feel good about your decision. And the mandating of it with no evidence, that I kind of just, I wear the mask, but just give me some evidence. And not that, sure, look, everybody's doing their bit. That just drives me crazy.
Yeah, well, that's how you subvert whole populations. I mean, we've thousands of year history here. You exaggerate a risk and then you provide a solution, and then people feel good about the solution to the perceived risk. So this is a tough virus, it's a real risk. But if the masks do squat all, you can keep telling and propagandizing the people to wear them. I'd say that's unethical, but you could kind of allow it. But to rush in the middle of summer in Europe for a clearly seasonal virus, right? The ICUs are empty, the deaths are gone off the map since May.
And we are mingling in summer. Last summer we all mingled. I find it hard to believe why nobody talks about the fact that the virus didn't spread. And then it will be, by this summer it'll be, it's seasonal. With everybody, it'll be okay to say it's seasonal, but it's still now nobody is saying it's seasonal.
Well, the CMO in the UK, who's kind of went crazy back in the summer in England, driving all this madness, Chris Whitty, he admitted, I think it was November, came out and said it. Well, it's seasonal and now the winter's going to be a problem. So they're kind of admitting it's seasonal, but when they brought in mandatory masks, they were denying. And the WHO in July, I think 20th, 2020, in the middle of the summer, they came out with a statement. No one provoked them. They actually came out with a bulletin and said, this is not seasonal. Right when it was obvious it was seasonal, they had to come out and say,
do you remember the beaches? I think in England there was the beaches. Surely then there should have been a huge spread.
This is where I am at a loss with my fellow humans. You don't need to be a hardcore science nut, or like I am, to get this. Cornwall case-demic, I called it at the time, and I was sent the data. Millions of extra people flooded into Devon and Cornwall and a couple other places. They packed the beaches. You couldn't get a restaurant table for weeks. They doubled the local populations. They were a hive of people because they couldn't go abroad. They were massed together, but it was in the summer, down in these areas. They only had small hospitals in those areas. They had no ICU, no mortality for 2-3 months of crammed people. Now remember, this is a population where the virus had been all over and around, and it had faded coming into the summer, but the virus was all over this population, and then they all crammed together on the beaches for months, and they had Soho in London was crammed with people, no masks. All that happened, but nothing happened. And that's because the virus triggers based on very complex equations not fully understood: humidity, vitamin D, a blood level of the human herd, and the amount of susceptibility or the amount of susceptible. And the virus can also inactivate itself. This is published on other viruses, can self-inactivate and look for an opportune time to trigger. So it's a very complex reason why in Europe it goes, and in other countries the season and the triggering is very different, like India. It's more like undulations and waves. So it's very complicated, but it ain't lockdowns and masks. And I'll give you a perfect example, Frank, that just occurred to me the other day. There's a million. Eastern Europe missed, and I noted this last April, May, they missed the seasonal trigger. Because I was thinking Eastern Europeans are maybe healthier, and there's other factors, but why did they not get a decent epidemic? And it looked like they seasonally just missed the trigger. They got away with it. Now, Czech Republic and Hungary and everyone, they were all being credited for their amazing lockdowns, but their lockdowns were no different than anyone else's. So that was a joke. What happened this winter? Well, they missed it the first time. So what happened? They got it. But you know the different thing here, and it proves lockdowns and masks are nonsense. They came in well in advance into this winter with rising numbers, and all of these countries locked down like insanity and masked like when you're going to the toilet, generally. And what happened? The curve, they're some of the worst in Europe now. They followed the exact same pattern. And they had the lockdowns and the masks locked and loaded before the epidemic hit. Made no difference. So Professor Karl Popper would say, if you take 100th of what you have in terms of negative evidence, each piece of negative evidence is very powerful. It's the asymmetry of proof. But he said, if you take 100th of what you've got in these 36 papers and in these examples, you'd be home dry. The lockdown mask hypothesis has failed. Now, you can make a new one and say, well, lockdowns and masks only work when the moon is in a certain phase. And that's a new hypothesis, and you can check against the evidence. But the hypothesis is now effectively dead in terms of any significant impact. It's gone. It cannot be resurrected.
But do you think now, so we're coming into the summer months, and if they remove restrictions, then and whatever, even without removing restrictions, but if they remove restrictions and they can say, well, it's all the great work that was done in January, February, March, April that helped the country lock down, and now you've all been mingling and being terrible, and when it starts back up again, September, October, November, December, they're going to blame it. I can't see an end to this.
So look, last summer, and I'll tell a little.
It was last summer. There was no cases.
Effectively, no.
Yeah.
There was no ICU or death. The only thing you can measure this by is death, and maybe ICU loading. If you make sure that your ICU numbers are driven by SARS-CoV-2 virus, not just people who are in ICU with stage 4 cancer, and they also have a positive test. But last summer, nothing was going on in Cornwall, in Devon. All the people crammed together. We know it's massively seasonal in Europe, and it's got different undulating, more complex seasons in, say, Israel and other areas of the world like Brazil. It's complicated. But last summer, I'm thinking in May, this is a fact, and I'm saying to my wife, okay, this is seasonal, we know that now, and we're going to have nothing going on till next, probably October, and then it will seasonally trigger again and there'll be more susceptible people. But how are they going to keep this nonsense going until October? How are they going to bridge? And what they did was, they kept some measures in place with the fantasy that those lowered measures were somehow doing something, which of course they weren't. And they began to talk about second waves, but not winter resurgence seasonally, which was a fact that was coming. They said second waves could come in August. Second waves like 1918 Spanish flu that came out of season, it came in September, August. They created this fear of a second wave, and they put mandatory masks on everyone when nothing was happening, right? And that bridged to the winter when this virus did trigger. And then they had what some people call the death porn. They now had a massive amount of terror again in the hospitals and busy hospitals. So it's almost like they kind of bridged till they got to the winter, and they knew when we got to the winter it was going to trigger again. And now, how are they going to bridge this summer? Well, this summer, it looks like they're going to keep lockdowns, even though everyone's breaking them now. And it's the dogs in the street know that everyone's kind of gone back to normal. But they're pretending, NPHET are pretending the lockdown is holding on.
Yeah.
We're coming into the summer. So they'll keep the lockdown as long as possible to create the illusion that that's what kept us safe. And then they'll have the vaccination and say, well, that now has saved us. But I think you're right, that they still want to, for whatever.
Well, they're going to stop the foreign travel. That's been planted now. So
but that's meaningless.
Oh yeah, but it's like you're describing. It's another measure to make it appear like there's control happening.
Yeah. So the travel, that's a good point. The travel, what's that mean? Nothing. It's meaningless. So you've got 5 million people in the country, and let's say you got 60 million in England. We've both got rates that are similar and mortality influx that are similar. We're both endemic now. It's all over the population. So stopping random people from England coming to Ireland, you might as well stop random people from Dublin going to Cavan. But what they'll do is they'll allow travel again, but keep the international. So why the international? Is it xenophobia? We're going to keep out other people with their dirty SARS-CoV-2. Well, hold on, we're riddled with it. You know, if you do antibody testing in Tokyo a few months ago, they got 50% of a sample in Tokyo had antibody positive to SARS-CoV-2. So people thought Japan had somehow controlled it with no lockdown.
Wait, let's take that, what you're saying there, and let's just, I'm going to take a slight different route, but let's just say we're running the show, okay? And we wanted to up the positivity in terms of the mood of the nation. One thing you would do is you do a weekly update of antibodies to show that's one small little thing we do. Here's a sample size of 1,000 people, and we've got the trends since last October. Say these are some of the corporate measures you put in place, and look, it's at 48% now, the antibody rate. And so we keep going this way here. That's one. We'll drastically improve the healthcare system. We knew about this last March. I give this example to somebody. Say last March we're sitting here, right? And you're head of the hospital. And I said to you, look, you're going to get huge demand. And you'll go, I can't manage this. You're going to have to stop the demand. In other words, demand for the hospital, right? And I'll go, okay, well, I'll lock it down then for you. But come October, this is going to come back again. You need to do something to be able to deal with this. We can't lock down again. And then come next November, you go, no, I can't handle this. You'll have to lock down again. And I'm saying to you, okay, you're fired. Surely, in the real world where you're trying to innovate, change things, and come up with creative solutions, and everybody around the room would go, okay, we've left the healthcare system for years upon years upon years now, instead of spending bazillions paying people to stay at home, let's invest a ridiculous amount of money now in healthcare. Isn't that the conversations that people who are anyway creative or anyway innovating would have? This is what I'm saying here.
It's so patently obvious that what you would do is shield the susceptible and extend your capacity. Yeah. And they did the Nightingale hospitals in England, and they did the ones in City West in Ireland. So in the actual epidemic, when it was an unknown and it was scary for many people, they actually began to do that. But then they dumped it all. They decommissioned. So they actually reversed the extended capacity and decided we're just going to do lockdowns. We're not even going to look at capacity anymore. So why would you do that? It makes no sense. Of course, in the corporate world, you'd be fired for that. The incompetence would be stunning incompetence. Stunning incompetence. Of course, you extend your capacity. And you know what? Even with no capacity, and they didn't bother. They didn't bother in the summer when they were putting our children in masks and threatening us with catastrophe this winter. They still didn't do anything to extend the capacity. I mean, there's no way you could do that in corporate. So that's a fact. They had no interest in capacity. One other argument they make is, well, we can extend the capacity, but it takes years to train ICU staff. Yeah, well, then you should have started in March and kept going hell for leather for the next year, right? Because this is meant to be an epidemic that's going to go on for years. Why? If you don't start it, you're never going to finish. But the other thing is, you don't need ICU staff. So think about this. You've got your ICU staff who are trained, a few years to train them, whatever. You have auxiliary staff. So in a corporate, what we would do is we'd say it's an emergency. So we don't need a 3-year fully trained, accredited ICU person for every person running it because it's an emergency. So we've got an emergency order. You take paramedics and all kinds of other people, and from March, April, May 2020 up until October, November, you've got 6 months. You train a load of auxiliary people to work under the fully accredited ICU staff, and you have the capacity, right? Yeah. And you have the oxygen. There's no shortage of oxygen, except when they messed up that as well. But so this is obvious, right? And the other thing, gbdeclaration.org, Great Barrington Declaration, all those top professors who are vilified in September, October, no brainer. You shield the susceptible, you extend your capacity, and you develop immunity in the non-susceptible. That is how you manage a flu-like illness epidemic. the data's in. They
But
were correct.
and like even say if it is kind of warlike pandemic, and if you have a fortress and you know there's one weak point in the fortress, which is the aged, and right, so are you going to constantly protect the entire fortress, or are you going to just make sure that that tiny little area is looked after? So do a phenomenal job looking after the aged. It seems
it's
to
better
me
than that. Your analogy, Frank. So imagine you had all your people. And imagine you've only got a small number who will be killed by the invader. So it's exactly like you say, you protect them. If you can't protect them, then there's no way you can protect everyone anyway, because you can't do the smaller job. So that's a no-brainer. But imagine that your other people actually get stronger by having scuffles and fights with the invader. They get stronger and stronger for a better, stronger society to better protect these weak people. You'd actually make sure you engage all the other people. You would not lock them down. Imagine if you lock down everyone, that your people all get weaker and the invader gets stronger. So they've done everything upside down and back to front. But remember, it all goes back to Bruce Aylward of the WHO in February 2020 on camera, send you the clip, and he pointed at China and said, look, China made that curve change. It's completely made up, and everything flowed from that. Lockdown was not in the lexicon before February 2020 in the West. It would not be even, they would not dream of doing it unless the streets were full of people collapsing.
And I have a problem.
No one knew anyone who died practically during the whole epidemic. That I know 2 people around 90 in a nursing home, indirectly, friend of a friend. But even now, after the second wave in Ireland, right, the winter wave, even now when I poll people, do you know people who died or went to ICU? Most people still don't. What kind of pandemic is that?
Yeah, and I don't know what it is the unquestioning. Even this sort of conversation is not, I mean, there's no opposition party. There's no, apart from Michael McNamara, the TD, who's tremendous, really.
Great
to
man.
me, it really is. He's a rare beast.
Yeah. He's driven on behalf of his children, though. So he knows what we're doing is just increasingly unhinged, and he just feels like I do. The future is for the children, and we're just making a complete mess of the world based on a severe flu level illness that we never did anything for before, and the science goes against everything that we're doing, and it's driving him crazy. I'm sure. I don't want to speak for the man, but I'd say it's driving him crazy.
Well, I'd say he has to be political and he has to be restrained, and yet still the passion is clear to see. But you've mentioned flu loads. Can you explain to a brain like mine why there's no cases of flu and no death from flu? Is it because we're all doing a brilliant job locking down and wearing masks?
Well, that's a tricky one because that involves science that's not very well known. So viruses compete with each other in the host population, and this is known. And to give an example, in the 70s, Dr. Edgar Hope Simpson wrote a fantastic book, The Transmission of Influenza, and he spent 50 plus years working on exploring influenza transmission because there's a lot of mysterious aspects to it. And he wrote this book. And he ran the first influenza transmission laboratory in the east of England, I think, in the 1930s. And he spent over 50 years on it. Wrote the book in the 90s. That's pedigree. Brilliant man. Problem-solving mind. But he was talking about this kind of thing. And in the 1970s, a new flu strain or a variety came in. I think it was America. And it kind of hit the population. But they'd been testing for flu for decades, and there was always this certain strain that was there every year, and it came back. And when this new one came in and went all over the place, they noticed that the old one was gone. And it was called in virology the vanishing trick. So there's a lot of science, DIP, differential interfering particles. Viruses can create kind of inactive forms of themselves in the host to stop themselves and to put themselves in dormancy. All of this technology I mentioned, I won't go into detail, is all very complex. So it looks like when SARS-CoV-2 went across the world, and by God it went across the world, all over the place. The influenzas, which are not a million miles from coronaviruses in terms of family, they both got the similar winter triggering in Europe. The influenzas appear to have kind of dropped out of the virome. It's a complex technical thing. Now, how would we say, well, it was the lockdowns and the masks would do it? Well, Sweden had no lockdowns, no masks, and their flu disappeared as well. Everyone's flu disappeared. I believe even in Belarus, that basically had military parades and football matches and raised a middle finger to the lockdowns. And they got a lot of pressure as well. Belarus did over that.
Yeah.
Their flu disappeared. So the most lockdown, again, we've got this problem. The lockdown and masked people, their flu didn't disappear any more than the guys who didn't really do much at all. Same in America. So it's a systemic, complex, technical thing that the flu dropped back and became less active. And some people said, well, maybe they're just not testing it and this coronavirus is really flu. Well, not really, because they did do quite a bit of flu testing, not as much as normal, but the percentage positive for symptomatic people with flu was very low. So they did sample. So flu has really stepped back. Interestingly, rhinoviruses. Germany, which locked down and masked to beat the band, the rhinovirus prevalence, and this is a summer virus, which is quite different than influenza and coronavirus, different family, peaks in the summer. Rhinovirus in Germany is worse and higher than it was in 2019. Rhinovirus ignored the lockdowns and masks completely, and the sanitizer, ignored it. So you see what I mean? There's all these triangulated proofs of sorts that say it's not the lockdowns and the masks. Really, it's more complex. But no one wants a complex but true story. They want a simple, dullard, simplistic story.
It sounds like, is it cannibal? Like it's like one eats the other, one dominate the hierarchy, and that comes in as the umbrella one then.
That would appear to be the case, that the flu and certain other viruses have dropped off the map, and they dropped off the map when SARS-CoV-2 triggered, basically.
See, what bothered me was that back in October, November was, cases are rising, the people are terrible, they're not socially distancing and they're not wearing masks. And then I'd say, wonder what the story is with flu. And the response is that people are socially distancing and wearing masks. And I kind of just went, okay, right, well, I do remember actually looking at that book or checking that book out that you mentioned. I think you tweeted about it, and at least it kind of gave that's kind of explainable. I kind of wondered whether the PCR test was able to distinctly differentiate the two, or whether there's a crossover between flu and a COVID and they're chemically similar in terms of how can you say one is one, but that's not the case. That's just a kind of an ignorant sort of
that was the concern, that flu was there to varying degrees but was not being measured or was being attributed to COVID. Now, look, there was last May or June from, I think it was Boston University, they did look closely and they found in people with COVID around 20% also had influenza varieties in the same host. So maybe there's an element of no one's really looking. But it would also appear that it genuinely has dropped out. Now, other people will argue on this, well, flu has an R number, a reproductive number or spreadability of 1.5, and this is 2.6. So flu is particularly responsive to lockdowns and masks. But to be honest, that just doesn't add up. But we'll see, Frank, again and again, like you just said, people and even academics and NEFIT will say anything to support the narrative. So I've seen this many times in my corporate career, and I've been involved in all kinds of corporate politics. It's the narrative that's important. The difference in corporate, like to your hospital example and preparing hospitals, in corporate you won't get away with a nonsense story. Because the profit imperative demands that we know the data. I used to have a phrase for 30 years, show me the data. Any trouble, any politics, any arguments over whose line is performing better or who's not, or whose hypothesis is right or wrong, I come in and I'm called in, show me the data. I'll decide. The data in this case, like we've discussed, is pretty clear as day. Nothing's 100%, but all the topics we've covered is pretty clear. But we are living in a world where it's not like a corporate where you want to get the right solution. It's massively politicized now.
Yeah.
And like you say, doubling down and covering the tracks. I'll give one more example. In Ireland last October, and I showed this, Nevitt wanted to bring in a level 5 lockdown when Tony Holohan came back from his break on a Sunday. They did a press release, embarrassed the government, we need a level 5. Varadkar, for some reason, said no. Obviously, it was the right thing to say no. I'm just not sure why he didn't just roll over, because anyway, we won't get into that. So for 3 or 4 weeks, there was no lockdown. Now, Nevitt then got their lockdown. But you know, if you look at the R curve, in October, the curve of the viral activity had curled over already, well before the lockdown. Now, if they had got the lockdown on that Sunday, this is the power of misleading. If you do a lockdown when the curve is rising, and you know it will go over and come down, if you do a lockdown when it's rising, and that's generally when you do a lockdown, when it's rising, you know, the problem is you create a false appearance, completely misleading. If you know a curve's going to do this and you do a lockdown on the rise, then you'll say, hey, look, I turned the curve. It's the equivalent of rain dance. And it's literally rain dance stuff.
Yeah.
If you know a little enough to be dangerous. Now, what they did, Tony Holohan's lockdown on that Sunday would have met the criteria of it's a rising curve, and it would have looked like it turned the curve. Luckily, by being 3 weeks late, clearly the lockdown was after the curve turned, clear as day. And also the curve shape never changed in the slightest with the lockdown. So the curve didn't even shimmy. So we have all these negative proofs, evidence, that the lockdown, if anything, is very ineffective at best. But no one cares.
But there's no desire, if you even take back to Sweden back last May, June, and you might have said to people, look, it's just Sweden haven't locked down. The response at the time was, well, they have a much better healthcare system now, and they're great, and they don't go out like us, and they're better. Essentially, there is every other reason as to not want it to be a good idea to allow your citizens decide for themselves.
It was massively politicised even before Sweden's results were becoming obvious. And at that stage, it was too late. Because to acknowledge Sweden would be catastrophic. And I'd probably stress this point. It wouldn't just be embarrassing for the authorities. The implications of acknowledging Sweden would have been catastrophic. Because the damage being done to all the economies and waiting lists and cancer screenings lost and all the other problems were enormous. So the slightest hint that it was unnecessary was absolutely too big to fail. You could never. So
it's too big.
It's not a conspiracy theory. People need to understand that the people running the show, even if they realised, bugger it, the lockdowns, it looks like from this study from Woods Hole Institute, that was the first I got that showed the lockdown didn't have any effect really. Even if they realise the lockdowns actually don't do much, they say, okay, we've got to make sure no one knows that, because otherwise we'll look beyond terrible. So there's an all in it together for sure. By around April, May, they were all in it together. The die was cast from Bruce Aylward in China in February through to what they did in Europe. There's no way there would be an admission that was incorrect under any circumstances.
You always give the example of Sweden, and that's the one that's most referred to. But Belarus, what is the story there?
Belarus got a bit of a spike in mortality later, in the second wave. It looks like it's hard to get the figures. Belarus are just going to look, and I have people in Belarus who told me, basically no different than anywhere else, with zero lockdown, just yet again. Yeah. Now, you can argue about Belarus figures. They're claiming no effect. Okay, they're undercounting. But you'd also argue that they're counting properly. They're only counting people who died really driven by COVID. Whereas the whole of the West has gone with WHO 2020 March. They basically said within 28 days of a positive test, if you die, that's a COVID death. Belarus said, screw that. If someone's wheezing and dying and they've got problems in their lungs and they get a positive test and they are dying, we'll count them. But that might only be one in 6 or 1 in 4. So this is the problem as well. Someone made the kind of black joke that in England we had 80,000 in 2020 or maybe 60 something thousand died excess over expected within 28 days of positive test. But in England each year around 100,000 people die within 28 days of a barber or a hairstylist appointment. You know? So you got to be really careful. You can only look at excess mortality. So people have said, oh, what does that mean? Each year around 1% of our population die. At the age average around 80, median maybe 85. Each year 1%. That's 10,000 in a million. In the corona year of 2020, you know, instead of 10,000, in some countries there was 10,050. In some countries like England, they got hit pretty hard by corona, and it might be 10,000, 700. But either way, it's an extra 0.1% worst case. And in the world, with a whole year of spread, I said this earlier, there's around 0.03% attributable to COVID across the world after a year of spread, and it's been all over the place in every country. These numbers, with an average age of 80 and a median age of 85, no disrespect to the people, but it's bringing forward a death slightly rather than you die like a 42-year-old in a car crash, right? That's a death. You lost 40 life years. It's not like that. You're bringing forward some elderly deaths and people who have conditions, sadly. But like 300 per million across the world is the average for the world. A pandemic.
And to that point, what is the risk by age, roughly speaking? So if you're below 50?
If dying below 70 is less than 0.05%, which is 500 people in a million, below 50 it's effectively zero. So the other day on television, this quite shocked me. Which one of them? McConkey, I think it was. Sam McConkey said, oh, well, it's 1 in 1,000 risk below 50. He said 1 in 1,000 risk below 50 for below 50. He's out by a factor of 50. It's around 1 in 50,000. That's the numbers. But he, on Claire Byrne, I think, uncontested, said that if you're under 50, it's still a risk of 1 in 1,000, and I don't think that's too small. Well, it's not too small, because you're 50 times out, McConkey, and he got away with it. It's around 1 in 50,000 rough and tough. I did it in the back of an envelope. If you're below 50, 1 in around 50,000. And you know what? If you don't have any conditions or diabetes or stage 3 cancer, it's probably 1 in a couple of 100,000. Like, these risks don't even exist below.
And yet you have
car accidents.
People walking around afraid.
Yeah, because they've been propagandized for a whole year, and studies have shown that wall-to-wall propaganda for even 3 to 4 weeks can subvert a whole population very effectively, except there's always 10 or 15% of people who have probably genetically evolved enough cynicism and independence to say, I'm not taking this flow of propaganda. I see disparities, I see incongruities, I see data that says there's something wrong with this stream that's entering my head from RTE, and in fact I think this is a toxic stream of nonsense.
And it's across the board though, isn't it? Though
it's
in every
RTE. They were all paid. They got a fund going last April. In England in March, the SAGE met psychological ways to make the public fearful. This is documented. They said they need to use social media, main media. They funded in Ireland all the media companies substantial money each quarter to run constant ads.
But have you noticed that it is people, for a huge amount of the time, it's people abusing other people. Like if you see young people out partying, it seems to be this onslaught of abuse, that they're a disgrace, that they're irresponsible. Like if I'm in my 70s, I've lived. I surely don't want young people to stop enjoying themselves. I actually think most of them would find it insulting.
If the elderly people at risk truly understood the basics of the science and the reality, they would say overwhelmingly, not in my name. What you're doing to my country, my culture, what we work for, right, since the war, since independence, you are ransacking everything just as I'm on the way out. You're doing it in my name. So there was a hashtag not in my name for that idea. Yeah. Now, many of the elderly will screech blue murder, but that's because they're propagandized. If they were truly informed about the risks and that it is a severe flu equivalent, no question about that, we have all the data now. It's not a bad flu equivalent, it's a severe flu equivalent. Substantial, nasty virus. But if they knew all that and they could see the numbers, they would say, what in the name of God are you doing to my country? And they'd be absolutely right. And you'd have to say to them, I'm sorry, but there's an international globalist, WHO, other organizations, WEF, have decided that this virus is very useful to move many plans and to manage the world forward. And a lot of these organizations have admitted it. They've said that on the record, publicly, they've said that coronavirus is a huge opportunity not to be missed, to reshape our world and bring in new technologies. Everyone has become a profiteer, from the mask companies, the PPE companies. That's a massive new industry. Obviously the medications is going to be $1 trillion profits, right, over the long term. And you've got all of the biggest corporates have increased their volumes and wealth, like Amazon, all the big corporates. Even pension funds have gone up and investments have gone up. Everyone is making a fortune except who? The most culturally apt people in Ireland. The tradesmen, the workers, the farmers, the ordinary people. They've been small businesses.
I kind of have a lament for the what's the right word with that kind of independent thinking that it just seems to be so say for example this conversation is utterly wrong, even though I think for the most part you have referred to figures and scientific papers from colleges around the world and data driven information, not bullshit, not data that has been twisted to prove a point, right? And you've left, you haven't been definitive. There's places where you can't be definitive, and that's the nature of it. But it's somehow this idea of your personal responsibility and personal freedoms that have been taken, and it's unquestioned. I have a kind of a lament for that. How far does that go? How far does it go?
It's shocking to me. I mean, I know why. We've spent 20 or 30 years turning into a nation of kind of safests. People have been removed 3 generations from the war, removed from real risk, they're removed from the land, they're removed from the hard work and toil and risk. All of that's gone, and we're all we're living in a bubble coming into 2020. No child left behind, 0 accidents, a whole atmosphere of everything is safe. Essentially, we've become extremely soft. Now, don't get me wrong, it's great to have lower road accidents, less farm accidents, that's all fantastic. But that's gone further than just minimising stupid accidents. And I think we have become, not me or you, but general people who are ripe for harvesting by what we've talked about here today. We were ripe because no one anymore really does anything for their community as much or for other people. We've become selfish, nose in a phone, nose in a laptop. The human race in Europe has become very self-oriented and materialistic. So all our people are there, and the slightest risk people have a panic attack. I've been joking about that for years. And now this comes along. And suddenly now there's a big crisis and you get to be a hero. So what they've told people essentially is, all of you now can be heroes and save Granny. No, they didn't tell you is, by locking down, you're probably putting Granny at more risk. You're going to actually kill Granny. Right? No. You're going to save Granny.
Well, you're going to make her last few years absolutely miserable as well. I mean, let's not even talk about that, but that's the reality.
What's been going on the last year is an explosion of unscientific thinking and perverse narratives. It's stunning. And I know a few people like me in the technical field, because I have lived my life always in problem solving, challenge my own hypothesis, find the technical truth, even if it looks bad for us. Many times I got burnt where the technical truth turned out my department I led was kind of at fault. But the technical truth must always come up, even if it hurts. Your hypothesis must always be challenged, and if you see a little piece of data that says you might be wrong in your hypothesis, you've got to spend the next day on that piece of negative data.
And have you got that? Have you had that any in the last 12 months? Have you had kind of moments where going, okay, I didn't expect this, or...
The first few months, I was literally waking up nearly every night briefly, go to the bathroom, and I'd have these flashes of, could I be wrong in the lockdown? But they faded after the few months because, as I said, the data was coming in, and I knew then, no, if we're wrong, it's just that lockdowns are very ineffective rather than useless, which doesn't matter because the costs are enormous. So, no, the doubt fell away, not because I was getting cocky, but months of endless self-questioning to make sure I couldn't be wrong, because that's my nature. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that at this stage, it doesn't matter what happens. We can never be wrong now because enough data is in. Things that caught by surprise was the severity of the UK-England winter wave was much bigger than we'd estimated. But that's only a prediction of extent. That's nothing to do with being wrong in the science. South Africa in their summer had a surprisingly robust wave, but now they have tons of antibodies and they're out of it. But it did happen in the summer. So there's these kind of anomalies. But the vast overall picture of where we are and my teams worldwide is correct. And that's all that matters. 80, 90, you have to be correct on the core. But yes, there's pockets, and my enemies go after the pocket.
Of course,
you said England. But in England, Ireland didn't have much of a mortality in actual impact winter wave, and Wales and Scotland not really. UK, England was remarkable. And there's something odd about England, and we wonder how much was denial of care from lockdowns, because England had big hits in the winter wave in young people who are not the cohort for this, and no one else had. So England and maybe one other country in Europe had very unusual young people with a big death spike in the middle of this. So I think there's a lot more questions to be answered about that winter resurgence. And also it's acknowledged there was unfortunate timing that, the vaccine, I don't care a fig about the vaccine personally, but it is hard on the body for some people. And this is well accepted even by the pharmaceutical companies. It gives you an inflammation for 7 to 10 days. Your immune system will plummet in many people. And if you take, in December, January, the oldest, frailest people in the universe, and you give them, a challenge, even if the vaccine is perfectly fine in general, let's just say you could hasten people who are close to the door. And the unfortunate effect there is you'll get a short kind of bigger mortality bump. And it's not that the medication killed them. It's just that, like anything that gives you an enormous physiological whack.
Yeah, I wondered about that.
And that's the shape of the curve.
Yeah.
That it came up in the winter and then it kind of kicked up and then tailed off again. If you look at the age distributions, I think there was a little bit of that in there as well. But no one will ever know any of what we said today. I mean, obviously people who watch it will, because most people have been propagandized and they will scream till they're blue in the face that there's no way all the experts are wrong. That's impossible.
Well, yeah, and I suppose that's where you'd love that legal people would get the grit between their teeth, make sure, like, I'd love to know, like, have NPHET ignored this information? Has it been presented and they've gone no? Because then what are they basing their decisions on? I'd love if somebody was able to inquire about that. You'd never know. Somebody just might get that grit within their teeth to go and do that and to go and ask the questions. Because now, you'd love a few heads. I'd love to see that, to be really that they're... But you could be waiting 10 years for tribunals and nobody will ever be blamed,
No
really.
one cares.
No one cares, yeah.
The whole system, when the system is incorrect, it's like the official secrets, 25 years locked documents.
Yeah.
25 years later, you find out the government lied, or in the case of America, the government did assassinate people with special operatives in Nicaragua and they overthrew the foreign government. But the thing is, once you keep it sealed for 30 years, doesn't matter
It's
because
over, yeah.
the people see it and it's really shocking, but no one cares. It was 30 years ago, yeah. But Fauci the other day came out and said the South African variant, which by the way has come up in Florida and other places and made no difference to the curves, he said it's effectively a new disease, and you, even if you had coronavirus before, you're 100% unprotected. And like immediately a couple of professors said, oh my God, he can't say that. And they kind of retracted
But
it.
it's out there already. The damage is
He
done.
did it. And he walked away from it. People who were saying, that's complete nonsense. He didn't even bother answering them.
Does the nature of a virus, does it change? There are variants. Is that the nature of it?
Since SARS-CoV-2 virus came out in March from Wuhan, from the science, looks like it was from gain of function in a lab, but we won't get into that. It's been mutating all the time. Thousands of mutations happen. It's a virus. When a virus comes out, a new virus, it's got the mutations that will happen in the future effectively encoded into it, and they're probabilistic. So a South African type variant will come up in around 8 to 12 months. And the other variant, they're all, by the way, very close to each other, these variants. So it's almost like B117X and B117Y in a sense. A virus evolves in the host and it does shift and change, and it allows it to keep a grip on the host. It also triggers in the seasons to give another spread. The virus is actually quite sharp for non-life, but the mutations that will happen, they're kind of programmed into it. So we talk about these variants like, wow, they're weird. They're not weird. It's normal for that to happen.
That's what I thought was the nature.
Professor Beda Stadler, the vaccine pope of Europe, I interviewed him again the other day. He's a pharma guy and he's an emeritus professor in immunology. He said this is a good news story. The fact that these strains are coming out as normal, it tells us we're on the rapid road towards this being a background endemic common cold. You can't get to background endemic without having the strains. That's part of the process of our journey to this being a background coronavirus. So he said it's good news, but what's happening? The media are terrifying people about it. The strains have really almost no extra virulence or impact on mortality. They may spread a bit better because they gain an advantage. It's not a huge deal. Bring on the strains, protect the susceptible insofar as you can, get your economy back running, get our children back developing, get those pieces of cloth off their faces before God himself cries on us with the criminality of what we've done to the children, I would say. And the masks, you could say they're not a big deal, but what makes me angry is it's criminal that non-scientific nonsense has actually been allowed to potentially affect the development of our children. So the Irish people, they've forsaken the children. Who'd have thought it? For nonsense and lies and propaganda. It's a tough one.
Well, it's fear, though. In the end, it's fear. But it's the problem.
And fear.
The problem is that people are almost immobilized because, well, they're hit with all these apparent facts, which are case numbers, and it's just one side of the story. I mean, if we looked at cancer figures every single day, if we looked at heart rate disease every single day, we would actually drive ourselves insane. I looked at it every 6 seconds somebody dies in Europe. If you were to constantly monitor death, it would make this quite uncomfortable living. And yet, that is essentially what COVID has been for the last 12 months. The reporting has been non-stop fear. Like, the reality is you've taken this on a B, not even a B, it's been last year you've been utterly and completely, more or less, consumed by this.
I'm juggling other projects. I mean, Patreon and PayPal guys have been fantastic because obviously I have no salary and I got 5 kids and they're young. So that's helped fill the gap, and I have some other projects on the side, commercial projects naturally, to keep things going in the long term, keep afloat. But yeah, a huge amount of time spent on this, and the demand is there because there's 10 or 15% of people generally who have managed, they have got the mental ability to not fall for this craziness, and they love the fact that someone is just putting out the data. Again, no anti-vax, no 5G, no nonsense. Someone who can read data is putting out the data in a form.
I think that's so important what you said there, that list, the no 5G, all that. I have to say when, we'll wrap it here, but there's been times during this thing that I kind of look and I see wall-to-wall fear, and I'll just go, oh fuck this, just switch off, and then I might see something posted by you, and I'll just go, okay. And I think for a lot of people it's kind of a lovely, it's just a lovely feeling that there is, that you're not going totally insane with just a logical brain is kind of going, yeah, it doesn't add up though. All the fear, all the wall-to-wall, 24/7, it doesn't add up.
No, of course it doesn't. Because at the end of the day, what was the phrase? Truth will out. And I know there'll be a lot of revisionism, and we get all kinds of nonsense reports will be published claiming that lockdowns did something after the fact, and it'll be denied that they were useless. And I guess history belongs to the victor in a sense, but the truth is the truth, and in the future it will have to be acknowledged, you know. But I think you're right, the legal profession hopefully can get off their ass.
I think that's
logical.
where
The police are smart guys, and I've heard from the inside they know roughly what I'm saying, but they got their orders, you know, and they're a government body really, but the fact that they all know that this is madness, largely madness, you know, that's got to help. And maybe more and more people will wake up, and we're coming into the summer now, and look, unless we get a South Africa very anomalous, very unusual problem, nothing's impossible, but can't see how that would happen. The curve has come down now, exactly in classic Gompertz. Ireland now is coming in. We saw last year into April and May the thing disappeared. The bad guys, I'll call them, whether they're useful idiots or whether they really are malign, they will be wondering, how do we get to next winter till we get some deaths back? You know, because in 6 or 8 months there's going to be people in the aged population. 6 or 8 months is an eternity. So someone who's a reasonably healthy aged person now, in 8 months they could be at death's door. So there will be a new crop, if you will, of very aged, or people who've gone from stage 2 cancer to stage 4 who are immunocompromised. As time moves on, each winter season you've built up a new group of highly susceptible. You know, if you didn't, then not a whole lot would happen next winter. But you'll have a new batch, and that batch will keep RTE alive all next winter. Unless they decide to say, oh, well, the vaccine's out now, so we're just going to ignore the problem.
And I mean, just on that, in terms of the media, is there any journalists out there that are shouting?
Oh, Niall Boylan is the only one I can think of on Classic Hits. And even he is getting highly pressured, I would guess. Highly pressured to stop talking. Because the censorship is massive and the funding of propaganda is huge. We have a problem, Houston. I mean, our media have become a kind of a Pravda. I'd never have believed in 1 year our media would become an arm of the state and effectively an arm of the pharmaceutical industry.
But should they're kept alive by both? That's the reality.
Problem,
I mean, because your RTE has been in shit for the last few years, so they're utterly kept alive by it.
It's qui bono, who benefits? Who? You just look at this and say, who is benefiting? Either in money, or financially, or in strategic progression of goals, if it's an organisation, or in lifestyle and comfort. We mentioned all of them. The people who are benefiting are huge groups, influential, and the majority who are propagandised are on their side now. And that's what's driving this madness.
Oh, good to shake your hand again, dude, and thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, we'll put a pause on this one.